Tell me about the day the FBI came to your house to tell you about your dad.
In February of 2005, started as a normal day. I was off work substitute teaching, and from substitute teaching, and I heard a knock on my door, and there was an FBI agent in my hallway, and I was already frightened because he shouldn't have been in my locked hallway. He should have buzzed in. And then he wanted to come in my apartment, and I didn't want to let him in. So I questioned even his badge, and when he came in, he said that, you know, my dad had been arrested and that they were pretty sure my dad was BTK. I had heard that there was a serial killer that was wanted back in Wichita, Kansas. Back, you know, they had been looking for him for 30 years. In 2004, I had heard in the news, but that's the first time I had ever even heard of BTK.
So you find out that this is your dad, and immediately, I'm sure you're not believing it at first at all, and then you're thinking, okay, was there any sign of it? You know, you started going through his life.
Right. I mean, at first I tried to alibi him and say he was like a Boy Scout leader and a church president and a really good father. I even pointed to the picture of him on the wall in his suit. And then I started thinking back, you know, to things that had happened, like with a neighbor that had been murdered down the street when I was 6. And so I mentioned that, and it ended up actually being one of my father's murders. We found out later that night. I started looking back then as time progressed and realized, you know, my father had committed these 10 murders. And I remembered like times my father had been like physically abusive with my brother 2 times when we were young adults. And I also remembered like my father being like verbally and emotionally abusive. But I think probably one of the hardest things for me was to realize, you know, what had happened to our neighbor lady, Mrs. Hedge, when I was 6.
Yeah. And you found out later that your dad actually had things around the house that were used for his crimes.
Right. So they found underneath a false bottom floorboard where we would ride out tornadoes, you know, in the Midwest. He had hid like jewelry of the victims and driver's license. And so he had carved out a false bottom in our wooden floor underneath like a cabinet. He also, as far as we know, had like what he called like a hit kit that he would take out when he was stalking, because he was still planning a murder up to the point he was caught, which came very hard for me to hear. You know, I always had thought that was the tornado box, like a safety box, because, you know, it would have rope and things in it like you might need. Yes, they found quite a bit of like other evidence that he had hid in our house, but they also found it at his office, and he worked down the street from the police in our small community, Park City. And, you know, my family, people will yell at my family still in the public saying like, well, he had stuff hidden in your house. And I said, well, he also had stuff hidden at the police department.
Yeah. You know, and this causes you to redefine everything. I mean, yeah, your dad might have been verbally abusive. He might have even been physically abusive on a few occasions, but that's a long jump to serial killer.
It's a massive jump. And I think it's important to remember that 7 of the murders took place before I was even born in the 70s. And then 3 happened between the time I was 6 and 12. So I was a pretty little kid. And also, like, we thought those few outbursts of my father physically was the very, like, if you think of an iceberg, we thought that was the whole iceberg and that was the worst he would ever be. And we didn't realize till after the arrest that we were actually just seeing the tip, you know, what my father was capable of. We were just seeing a very slight amount of what my father had done.
So tell me how this is affecting you, because you grew up loving your dad like every little girl. Despite, you know, some of those outbursts or some of the words that he would say, you adored your dad. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden your whole life is blown apart. There's a media frenzy surrounding you. How did this impact you?
I didn't even know how I was going to survive the first night. I fell into physical shock. When the FBI agent notified me, I was like holding on to the wall. I mean, I felt like the whole earth had come out from under my feet. Everything I knew, everything I loved, everything I cared for was gone in a flash. And I was terrified for 5 days, just trying to hold on to anything. And the first night, I tried to alibi my father. I got online, I was looking at crimes, and I was just absolutely devastated. I had nothing left. And that's when you just sort of cry out, Abba, Father, like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this night. And that's when I didn't have any strength to pick up my Bible. I tried to pick it up and it just fell to the floor. And God gave me Psalm 23 that night, you know, and it ran through my head all night in pieces. Like, I'm terrible at scripture memorization, but, you know, he was saying, like, even though you walk through the valley of the shadow of the death, I'll be there beside you, rod and staff. You know, and that first night, it just ran through my head over and over, like pieces of it. And I woke up the next morning, you know, and I've woke up every morning since. But like my faith that I had like gained in college is what got me through, you know, basically hell, or I wouldn't be here if I hadn't had that.
That faith, you know, as you're wrestling with, you wrote to your dad for a while, you cut your dad off for a while, back and forth, you know, feeling not safe with him. You haven't seen him since he was arrested.
Yeah,
correct?
no, I haven't seen my father. It's just really complicated because it's not like a normal visit. He's in a very far room and it's through video. I'm also just not comfortable. I have PTSD still from the trauma of finding out. So
when the trial happened, you heard he gave details, and then you heard details of evidence of all the things your dad had done, which is horrifying.
Right. I mean, most of my PTSD actually comes from how I was notified that first several days of being in physical shock and not getting care until we got me home to my family. But really the first 6 months I was dealing with the media, trying to reconcile my memories with what I was learning. And then all of this horrible stuff came out at the plea and sentencing. And I actually cut my father off for 2 years after the sentencing because I couldn't deal with what he was saying and what I knew about him. And he even had like dismissed my family in court, calling us social contacts and pawns in his game. So I cut him off, and then I got pregnant. So I felt like I needed to write him after working in therapy, you know, and starting to heal. And then I cut him off again for 5 years. And I didn't write him for 5 years until I forgave him.
Okay, and so tell me about that moment of forgiveness and how that even happened, because I think for most of us, we're like, wow, how did you ever forgive your daddy for what he did?
So I knew as a Christian it was important to forgive somebody, and I knew God had wanted me to forgive eventually. And I was so hard-hearted against God, I wouldn't even go to church and hear my pastor talk about forgiveness, and I knew that's what he was talking about. I would skip that week. So God was working on me in church and healing me slowly, giving me a quiet, peaceful life, which is what I had prayed for years after my father's arrest. And I still I was holding out on forgiveness. I was holding out on God. And he wrestled with me all fall. I was laid up with an injury in my leg, and I was mad, and, you know, I couldn't run after my kids, and God just worked on me and softened me. And I was driving home in December from a movie, and it was late. I was stopped at a red light, and it was like just a light hit me, like from above, just like hit me right in the middle of my soul. And I knew it was God, and I knew he was gave me the forgiveness to forgive my father. Like, the forgiveness came from God. It wasn't from me. It was something he wanted me to do to get rid of that rot that was in me. Because I thought I was doing okay. I was a mom, I was a women ministry leader, I was a wife. On the outside, I looked like I was doing fine, but on the inside, I was basically dying because I had all this hardness and nasty, awful, like everything I knew about my father was just sitting in me.
And what happened to you when you forgave him?
It went away. It was like that night, he lifted it out of me and filled me back with hope. And I drove home and I ran up my stairs and I told my husband, Darian, I said, I've forgiven my dad and I'm gonna sit down and write him after 5 years of not talking to him. So I filled like a 6-page letter full of just like about his grandkids and our new life in Michigan and the life he doesn't have. And at the end, I told him, I've forgiven you. And you know, if you'll ask for forgiveness from Christ, I'll see you in heaven someday. And then I just realized like he had cost himself that life that I had.
Yeah.
And after that is when my husband said after that's when I came back to Kerri and I was no longer BTK's daughter.
That's so good. There's so much more we could talk about. You wrote about this whole experience in detail in your new book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, and it's subtitled My Story of Hope, Love, and Overcoming. I know you want to give people hope through your story. And I just want to say to you, you know, the enemy is so good at putting shame on us, you know, and I want to say it is not on you. What your dad did, it's not on you, right? And so we're going to pray for you that your identity and that all the things that God wrote for your story beyond this will be laid out for you in the months and years to come. Thanks so much for coming on
Thanks so
today.
much for having me.
And sharing your story. We'll be right back.